Now, there's a principle called order of creation, and so the highest is spirit, and because spirit created the physical realm is second, and then the fictional realm is on the bottom. And so when it comes to jurisdiction, spirit has the highest jurisdiction. But are they threatened by me and my work? I don't think so, because I'm not threatening them. I'm not going to war against them. I'm not trying to fight them. I'm not trying to destroy them or, bring down the government or any of that kind of stuff. And a lot of the freedom movement is trying to do that. To me, that's an act of war. And yeah, if there's a means to help build the bridge, and there's a way of doing that through a technology like Bitcoin or, a blockchain technology like that is and supports people's sovereignty without it being controlled or manipulated by central banks or, the hidden hand of the globalists, then I would entertain that as part of the bridge. And if that helps mediate the process, I'm all for it.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Proof of Claim podcast. I'm your host, Todd Price, and joined with my co-host, Anil Bharat. And today we've got a special guest from Anil's home country. So I'll leave it to Anil to introduce him.
Yeah, absolutely. So today I've invited, his given name is Rob in the Paget family, but he goes by his spirit name, which is White Walking Feather. And he has an interesting story, and part of the reason why I wanted to have him come on the show to share his life story, the way he's living is unlike many of us have experienced before. He's emancipated himself from the king in early of 2008, April of 2008. This is a journey that he's explored and documented on a film called Ungrip. He's now teaching the PASM Art of Peace to those who want to heal and explore healthy relationships with themselves, the Creator, Mother Earth, and other people. And he also has a book that's called Graduating Life with Honors, and it's free to anyone who's interested in walking that path of peace. So I'd like to give you the floor, and you could introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about the beginning of this journey that you have started with emancipating yourself back in 2008. Maybe we can start there.
Well, thank you. I'm honored for the opportunity to speak to you and your viewers. My journey actually started earlier than that because I went through a life-altering event where I was faced with a change or die choice as I was struggling with depression, addictions, abusive behaviors, and that sort of thing. And I speak of this because the sovereignty that I explore is about learning how to govern myself and having the capacity to be able to communicate in my feelings and how to communicate with people in healthy ways and without violence or coercion or passive aggressive behaviors. All that kind of stuff is part of this journey and the core of it. So, in 2005, I realized that my relationship with the state wasn't healthy either. And that was as a result of this healing process, this healing journey I went through. And so that's when I realized it's time for me to set some boundaries. And in 2008, like you said, I set the boundary and said, I'm done with this relationship. And I declared peace, and I informed the Queen at the time of my choice, and committed myself to returning back to Mother Earth to be able to provide for myself and my family instead of receiving benefits and privileges from the Queen or from the state. And it's been a long journey ever since, trying to figure out what that looks like and how to actually walk that path. For many years, I was focused on the legalistic aspect of it until I found that yeah, there's actually a spiritual path that's way simpler and way less confrontational, is very much more peaceful and available for most people if they want to choose that path. And yeah, it was 2008 when I sent back all the documents that I had in my possession, because I realized they actually don't belong to me. They, you know, some of them actually says the property of the government of Canada or property of government of Alberta. So I sent it back to them because I was in possession of property that wasn't mine.
That's,
And
that's yeah, that's a very interesting, backstory. There's quite a bit of different groups, I'll say, and approaches to the life path that you've chosen to embark upon. And help me understand, let's say, the difference between your approach and many of the other approaches that maybe some people in the audience are exploring currently right now. Maybe you can speak on that and help explain those differences.
well, I think the best way for me to do this is to explain that for me, I had to explore what the true relationship with the state, with the king, actually was. And somebody actually sent me a book. It's called A Treatise on Copyhold. It was written in 1817 or something like that. And it described how, you know, the king's domain was governed. You know, Sir William Blackstone's commentaries of the late 1700s is very similar too. And this is all based on feudal principles. And when I realized that, all of a sudden it kind of made sense to me how all these relationships work with all these benefits and privileges, and even property being owned. You know, people don't own property. They, you know, this is a grant from the king to possess land, and persons are listed on the title as tenants. Rent is due and payable each year in the form of property tax. You know, all these are services that are owed to the king, and you know that's why it's called Service Canada or Service Alberta. It's not there to provide service to people. It's there to collect service and manage services owed by people to the king. And so when I started seeing all of these relationships for what they actually were, it made it easy for me to emancipate myself from it and do it in a peaceful way, so that I'm not being disobedient or that sort of thing and getting into trouble with the king, but instead doing it with honor and integrity. And in my experience, that's been respected and honored by the king because he leaves me alone. I'm not harassed by him or his subjects. You know, I have interactions with them every once in a while, but with a simple letter, I can then, you know, make it clear what jurisdiction I do stand in, because I refuse to have the king as my master, because my master is creator, and nobody gets in between my relationship between me and creator. And that's who I'm dedicated to. And walking that path is very different than having the king dictate to me what I can and cannot do. Spiritual law is a higher jurisdiction than the king's law. And so by emancipating myself from being a subject or a serf, which is essentially a slave of the king, I now can, you know, live my life, which is way more simpler. But it's also more challenging because I'm not receiving any benefits or privileges from the king. You know, there's no healthcare, there's no employment insurance, or, you know, any of that kind of stuff. You know, I have to take care of that myself. And so right now I'm exploring restoring our ancient tribes so that we can build relationships, healthy relationships with other people, so that we can start looking after one another and providing for one another in a loving, peaceful way, rather than using the king's monopoly on force and coercion to get things done. The king has blood on his hands, and I'm not down for that. And so I emancipated myself from all of that and choosing a different path in my life.
So
Go ahead.
So yeah, so what would be like? I think off air you were mentioning sort of your last engagement with your career. Actually, something that I forgot to mention is that you actually have a long history in a very technical background in IT. Could you kind of maybe share a little bit about, what was your technical background, and then what was that kind of story? If you could share that story of sort of your reason for eventually leaving that career that you have for such a long time.
Yeah, I was introduced to computers back in the early 80s in school, and I then trained to be a programmer, but my interests were actually in more technical, so I ended up getting certifications with Novell at the time, but Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer was one of the certifications I got, which allowed me to install and support file servers, print servers, mail servers, web servers, all that kind of stuff for the Microsoft products. And so I was working with multinational corporations, integrating systems with mainframes, mini computers, through fractional T1 links across country, and literally installing sites onto the internet, because the internet was so brand new back then that many sites didn't even have internet access. So and I did that for 20 years, and the end of my career I was working for the Alberta government, where we were installing computer systems in physician clinics back in the early to mid 2000s. And this program was to integrate the healthcare systems in the physician clinics with the extended healthcare facilities, acute healthcare facilities, labs, pharmacists, and as well as provincial government, to integrate all that so that they can have electronic medical record systems for the whole province. And that's when I realized that what I was building was a system that could track people from birth to death. And because I started exploring my relationship with the state and realizing how abusive it was based on my own recovery, that's when I started realizing that I'm in an abusive relationship and I'm participating in that. And my spirit cried out, and I couldn't do it anymore. So I ended up walking away from a 20 plus year career in IT, and moved my family out into the land and started living off grid and teaching my boys how to be self-sufficient and how to navigate life in a different way.
That's such a drastic, change from living. I don't know if you were living in a city or living out sort of in a country-ish area, but you were in the city. So,
yep.
So was there sort of somewhat of a time period where you were sort of preparing for this and you learned these skills to live off the land, or how did that transition take place?
Well, I grew up on a farm, so I had a pretty good idea of how to grow food and that sort of thing. But yeah, I was in the city for many decades, and we spent maybe 6 months doing some research, figuring out how to do it and that sort of thing. But then we realized, well, let's just jump in and learn along the way, because we're going to make mistakes, and we'll learn that way. Otherwise, we could be researching for 10 years and not change anything. So we decided, let's just jump and go. And so we sold everything. I quit my job, and we literally started figuring it out along the way.
Wow. What? So
it was a leap of faith.
Yes, yeah. So walk me through so what was the first thing that you guys did in terms of shelter? Like how did you, did you explain that part to me?
Sure. We literally had a little camper that we were living in while we built a garage, and then the garage we built in a few months, so then that allowed us to get in there for winter, and then we stayed in there for a couple of years while we were building the airship. And then after a couple of years we moved into the airship, and then we started building chicken coops and greenhouses and gardens and all that kind of stuff, so we can start growing our own food and raising livestock. And we're homeschooling our boys too, so we're teaching them, well, still teaching them how to read and write and that sort of thing. But their education was, the trades, how to build, how to steward animals, how to, plant gardens and, growing your own food. And we also built a structure for my mother-in-law, so, they were then introduced to construction and electrical and plumbing, but also how to look after their elder. So they're responsible for checking in with their grandmother and helping her out and that sort of thing. So I wanted multi-generational family to be reintroduced, because there's a lot of benefit to our youth being with our elders and learning from them and connecting with them and serving them. So that was part of their education.
And so I was following you along. When we first met, it was actually quite. Was it 2000? I think it was in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. But I've been since then. I've been sort of following you on Facebook, and I got to see, the film Ungrip, which was a really great film. And then also I got to see kind of you document and share your, building the Earthship, which was really, really cool. So my question is, with regards to, like, what were some of the interactions or engagements that you have experienced, good or bad? Well, let's just say confrontational. Were there any sort of roadblocks, road bumps along the way with regards to interacting with the state, the governor general, the king or queen, at the time that you were doing this transition?
Well, yeah, I built the airship without building permits, and the municipality, sent a cease and desist order, and I sent them a letter, and they all kind of went away, like, we continued building, and they never bothered us. Recently I was in Ontario, and my neighbor, I happened to be there when it happened, but the building inspector and bylaw enforcement officer dropped by, and they were quite aggressive. And so I managed to, buy us some time, and so I sent them a letter. It's actually a conditional acceptance that I use, where, I agree with their claims, but then I put the burden of proof on them, because the one making the claim has the burden to prove their claims. And I asked them to prove their claim that they are following spiritual law, law of love your neighbor as yourself, that they're following that in regards to, what the Crown has done, because the Crown has engaged in genocide and fraud and coercion and conflict of interest and all that kind of stuff in regards to their navigation of treaties, and which is the foundation for any land patents that they issue, which is the foundation for any titles that are issued. And so I challenge them on all of these things. And in that scenario, they went away for a year. And then a year later, they stopped by with a couple police officers. And but the interaction was very different. They were very respectful. They were extremely precise with the words that they were using. They wanted to make sure that they weren't crossing any boundaries. They were asking questions, not making demands. It was an encounter that I was like in awe of, because this is the way authority should be speaking to people. The one fellow, the by law enforcement officer, he was in awe of the letter, and he was like calling around other jurisdictions and, oh, this has got to be a precedent setting case and all that kind of stuff. And he checked out my profile on Facebook and started reading my book, and was like, this is cool, because now I'm planting seeds in people that have this perceived authority. And I challenge the police officers too, because the land is sacred, and it was a sanctuary, and they're armed. They're a military force on sacred land. And when I challenged them on it, they were going, we don't have anything to do with this. We're just here to keep the peace. And they literally took a couple steps back. And so we talked for 2 hours, and in the end, I invited them to ceremony. And so we got in a circle and we smudged and we said a prayer, and they were respectful. They took off their hats and they left. And, there was another scenario to finish off the story, but in the end, they all went away, and it was peaceful. And I know for a fact that my approach impacted somebody, because that kind of experience, it's rare to, especially these days, and this is only just a couple of years ago, to have an experience like that with authority. It's unheard of. But I know in my heart that if we do this from a place of love, and if we're standing in the right jurisdiction, they will respect it and honor it and be very respectful when they're talking to us. And I've experienced that. So
there's a couple of things you've said in there that very interesting, like the idea of conditional acceptance. I'd like to hear some thoughts on that, but also I guess the idea of authority, and then the authority of love, and the spirituality you speak of. Like, where is the conditional acceptance is, I'm familiar with that term, but I'd be curious to hear how you spoke of a jurisdiction, and what is the line of authority into the jurisdiction that you want to exercise your claims from, or your conditional acceptance, and then the jurisdiction that they are operating from, and the line of authority there.
Yeah, well, the conditional acceptance actually comes from scripture, because in the book of Matthew, Christ said, agree with thy adversary quickly, lest you be brought before a judge and put into jail. So that's what I do, is I agree, because I'm not supposed to be creating disputes. If I create a dispute, then I'm acting in dishonor. So I agree. And I get to place the burden of proof on them in order for them to gain my acceptance. Now, there's a principle called order of creation, and so the highest is spirit, and because spirit created the physical realm is second, and then the fictional realm is on the bottom. And so when it comes to jurisdiction, spirit has the highest jurisdiction. The physical realm is this realm of the physical kings that govern this realm, and they then, through the power of our own creative minds, created this fictional realm. Well, the fictional realm actually has the lowest jurisdiction. But what's happening is in my view, they're trying to flip it all upside down so that the fiction is the highest authority, which is false. And so I call them out on that. So what I did is I acknowledged and recognized that when I was a feudal serf of the king, having these fictional constructs like persons in my wallet, that I was putting myself at the very bottom. And then, I felt like a slave. But when I returned all those back to the agencies that created them, and emancipated myself from being a feudal serf of the king, and instead being subject to the jurisdiction of creator, place myself into spiritual jurisdiction, which puts me up above any jurisdiction that governs Mother Earth. And but that requires me to also, work on healing so that I can learn how to love myself in order to love other people and not make claims against others. So I work really hard not to make any claims. I work hard to walk that path of peace and love. And to do so required that I not receive any benefits or privileges from the king either. So this required me to restore my relationship with Mother Earth. So my tribe is, the trees and the moose and the bear and the snakes and the mice and the water and the air. Those are the relationships that I now work on restoring myself to proper standing, because they're the ones that will actually nourish and protect my body, because my body came from the land. It's nourished and protected by the land, and it will return to the land after it passes. And so I work hard to navigate that relationship and do so from spiritual jurisdiction, not the king's jurisdiction or not some fictional construct.
So that spiritual jurisdiction, there's, I guess, multiple different definitions of spirit, or there's a spirit in indigenous culture, and they might talk of the rainbow spirit, or the rainbow serpent spirit in Australia. I'm not sure the creation myths there. Other ones have a different creation origin. There's spiritual elements in Christianity and such. So where's the sort of coherence on this spiritual plane and the authority of it, and the protocols, I guess, and the law there? Where is that sort of documented, and how do you exercise claims from that jurisdiction?
Well, I don't, like I said, I work hard not to exercise claims, because then the burden of proof is on me.
Yeah.
But I will admit that I've been influenced by the Red Tribes of Turtle Island. They're the ones that have introduced this spiritual concept to me. But I also study scripture and acknowledge that, these teachings that Christ shared, I work hard to integrate in my life. It's to be able to heal myself so that I can hold the charge of what it means to have like a Christ level of conscious awareness in navigating my life. And so, I do believe that there is a being that has, no time, no mass, or any of that kind of stuff, that created everything here. So I work hard to honor that creation, to replenish the earth, which is to bring prosperity for all life, and to love my neighbor as myself. And so I do study scripture. I also study other texts to try to find a way to navigate what that actually looks like, to walk that path of, spiritual enlightenment, and do so without doing harm to anybody or declaring war, but instead holding space for healing, peace, and love. And I've found that through my recovery from my addictions and my own trauma and my own abusive ways and that sort of thing, that that was a huge learning for me, to be able to figure out what it's going to take for me to be able to walk this path.
And it's always still just a process of discovery, isn't it? You step into that dimension, and it's very, there's no other like external reference points. There's a few people that are maybe trying their own hand at conditional acceptance, or rebutting attempts to contract you in joinder and things like that. but it's hard to find the accurate information to act upon. So I think that, yeah, the more we can look internally and find out what's relevant to us, refine our own capacity to discern that which is true and which is in peace and love.
Yep.
You know,
it's an internal journey, and for me, through my healing journey, I had to learn critical thinking. So instead of just taking other people's words for it, I had to sit and think, well, how does that feel? Like, does that resonate? Does that fit in with that moral foundation that I want to live my life by? I had to ask myself the question. I had to confront myself. I had to challenge myself, and take that leap of faith in myself and in Creator to be able to guide me through this. And I also acknowledge that I'm going to make mistakes. It's up to me to remedy the mistakes when I do make mistakes. And this is a lifelong journey. This isn't something where, I can read a book and, oh, okay, I got it, and then, move on. This is something that is a constant daily exercise for me as I navigate this. And I'm constantly questioning myself and evaluating, am I on the right path? Is this what Christ was trying to teach us on how to walk our path?
So do you generally find that the scripture of Christianity is the most effective in at least speaking a shared language with the authorities and the state and such to advance arguments, or
well, it's worked for me.
Yeah.
Again, everyone's got to make their own choice on which texts, or I know there's lots of people in the red tribes, they have their own teachings, but for me, scripture was important because not only has I found some truth in it for myself, but the king swore an oath on the Bible, so now I can also hold him accountable to that. And that's what I've also done with my conditional acceptances. And that's why I can say, are you following the way that Christ taught? Because, all these people that swore an oath to serve the king, they're supposed to help him fulfill his oath to the Bible. And so even if I don't believe in the Bible, I can definitely use it to hold him accountable to it. And so that's what I've done in the conditional acceptances as well.
Do you find there's a difference in different Bibles in their effectiveness?
Yeah. And I've written about this in my book where, each of the translations have manipulated words and manipulated passages in order to hoodwink people into being obedient to the government. And, even like the word witchcraft came actually from the word pharmacia, which is the root word for pharmaceutical. And so there's many manipulations in the Bible, and so I can't just read it word for word in certain versions because they're all a lie. I have to go back to the original translations in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic to be able to do that evaluation for myself. That's my responsibility, is to do that instead of trusting a priest or some other individual to do the translations for me. It's up to me to do that work.
Yeah, or people, you can work together. Do you have others that you work with that you're on a mission collectively, or is it very much individual?
No, it's very much an individual journey for me.
Yeah,
okay. Like I'll listen to other people, and I'll if some people have things to share like online or that sort of thing, I'll listen to it, but I won't take their word for it. I always go back and try to figure out for myself and see, is this resonate with me? Is this fit? If not, I will dismiss it. But if so, then I will do what I can to try to integrate it and figure out how to fit it into this path that I'm on. And that's that continual self-improvement process that I've been working on.
And do you think there's a general, if they're all different, but is there a general deterioration or a general neutering of scripture over time? Like, are the older ones more effective than the new? Because I've seen in some, like the new, I haven't read many of the new ones, but that they'll change the name of Christ or or the Lord, and they'll just refer to him as him, and there's a diminishing of the actual sort of pronouns and the reverence, I guess, and an insertion of more just impotent language, I guess, and less
Yeah.
glorification or something.
Yeah, like the 1611 version of the King James Bible still has some manipulations in it, but it's pretty close. But you still have to be careful. But when you start getting into the New International Version and all that kind of stuff, they're not even close. You know, I wouldn't use them for paperweights. It's not worth reading anything that, you know, if anybody quotes anything from some of these newer Bibles, I'll dismiss it completely, because I know most of it is a lie.
Yeah, that's the way I sort of see the 1611 is it's related to the concept of setting something in stone. So by giving it that authorization and saying this is the king has given this royal assent or whatever it is, and it's fixed into this structure, it allowed you to all be operating, even if it's slightly wrong, at least it's not deteriorating as you're operating, and you've got a standardized set of scripture, which is really useful because you track the changes against that, and you realize they're diminishing these opportunities to achieve remedy through something, and they're taking away some of the subtleties of a verse that might say how God is no respecter of persons or something. And
yeah, and I have a 1611 version, and I got it because that's the version the king swore his oath on during his coronation. You know, that's the version that the queen swore her oath on as well too. So I'm holding him accountable to the 1611 version.
That's a different God, really, there, isn't it? Of the Church of England, this AKJV, than it is of the God that the Protestant and the Catholic churches aren't really, at least on paper, they're not really going to the same entity. People can find their own personal connection, and they may, not saying that Catholics are, not going to the right. They're having their own interpretation, reading the scriptures, and their own relationship with the Creator. But at law, and you're looking at these different estates and different authorities, the gods are kind of very different, and they're totally different realms under each faith.
Yeah, and I wouldn't also put it past them to be swearing other oaths that diminish or even revoke that oath that they swore on the Bible. So I don't know what other oaths that they've sworn in private or in some other society or any of that kind of stuff. So I don't have a lot of faith and trust in the kings of the world, because I in all the rabbit holes that I've dived down over the years, I know there's other things going on, and so I don't take them for their word.
So you reckon he might have had his fingers crossed when he's taken his oath on the Bible? That's interesting, because there's, from my understanding and readings and such, it seems there's a surface level of optics and signaling and doing these rituals and oaths, and then there's a whole world of signaling that's much more subtle underneath that, and a field of semiotics and a field of numismatics with the money, and heraldry with the devices that are being used there, and flags and crests and seals and such, that not many people realize. And a little slight change to an heraldic device can signal a totally different authority and signal an obedience. And there's, with the monarchy in Britain, they've got several different crowns that they can wear, and some of the crowns will indicate one authority is in play, and wearing a different crown indicates that you're subservient to another realm or master.
Yeah, well, and there's multiple crowns. Like there's the crown of the City of London, there's a crown of the king, but there's also the crown of the Pope and the Vatican, and
the St. Edward's crown and the Imperial Tudor crown.
Which crown are you talking about? There's so many crowns, it's going to require some magic and voodoo to really figure out which jurisdiction they're talking about. And the fictional constructs that they create through all of this word magic and that sort of thing is extremely confusing and complicated, and very few people can fully comprehend it.
Yeah, I agree. It's
And
a
that's by design.
Yeah, and it's this, the things are so subtle that someone might not realize.
It could be just a simple hand gesture will make the flip. It's like,
Yeah, there. Who knows there? But there's interesting things. So if you look back in history and you see Victoria, she used to wear the imperial Tudor crown, with the intact arches over the top, and then following the abdication in 1936 and moving through to Elizabeth II, that they're coming out in the St. Edward's crown, which has a dipped arches over the top, and that crown has a very controversial history. I think it was first surrendered by Edward the Confessor in 1066 or something to the Pope, and leased back to him. And then during the times of Cromwell, it was destroyed several times. And you have the with the Glorious Revolutions in 1688, the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights 1688, they say anyone with an oath and obedience to the papacy is forever excluded from holding office in this realm. So there's constantly been this battle to try to differentiate separate jurisdictions and estates or authorities, and there's a constant bleed of, I would say, like tyranny, moving constantly trying to oppress the most empowered spiritual realm, or the one with the best protocols and defense against tyranny is constantly trying to be defanged and made more impotent.
Yeah. And because of that complexity, like when I emancipated myself, I sent my letters to, the lieutenant governor, the governor general, but I also sent it to the king directly, or the queen at that time. But I also sent it to the Pope because I didn't know which crown I was dealing with. So I sent it to multiple crowns. And so, it was my intent to make it clear that, I'm not going to be subject to or obedient to any crown.
Mm-hmm.
And they can play their games, all these fictional constructs, they can play all the games they want. I'm out.
And that's your right to self-determination, to wherever you see fit. And so where would you say that the realm is, or wherever you're self-determined to, and are you the only one standing in that terrain, that dimension realm, or is there others that have?
I stand in spiritual jurisdiction because I've accepted Creator as my master.
Mm-hmm.
And I work hard to govern myself under the standards that Christ has laid out for me. And that allows me to walk upon Mother Earth and to fulfill my duty to replenish the earth. And so I'll do that to the best of my ability. But that requires me to navigate my relationship with all of life and to learn how to be a proper steward. And that's been like the huge learning curve that I've been on for the last 20 years is, how do I steward the land, which requires me to build profoundly intimate relationships with all the plants and the animals that are around me, and to be able to, communicate with them and connect with them and, figure out what my role is in all of these relationships. And it's intense. It's, this is a huge learning curve.
Mm. And so does that, I guess, restrict your the scope of do you travel into? Have you traveled internationally, or do you stay relatively put in your
Well, I've traveled across Turtle Island in what people would call Canada. I have ideas on how I could travel to other areas of Mother Earth, but I have no interest in doing that right now because I'm trying to learn how to be a steward here.
Mhm.
But I do travel. In feudalism, the roads are called the King's Waste, and they're there for anybody to use as long as it's not being done commercially.
Mhm.
And so I do travel.
But maybe the international side's a little tricky, crossing borders and.
Well, I would have to do it the way the Queen did it, because the Queen traveled without a passport too.
Mhm.
So, if I was to do it, I suspect I would probably have to write a whole bunch of letters to get consent and permission from all the different jurisdictions to be able to do that. And with the companies, whether I'm flying or on a boat or whatever, to get passage. And so I'd have to do all the work to gain all that consent first.
Yeah.
What
Not
was,
that convenient.
It's not
Yeah.
convenient. Walking this path is nowhere near convenient.
Yeah.
It's a huge challenge.
I'm curious, in the early, back when you did the transition, you spoke of certain things that the king had done fraudulently, and that then you talked about certain. I'm wanting you to kind of like go in deeper on that, where you talked about how they did something fraudulently, then they created patents which was based on fraud, and that's how they have control over the land, and then from the land is where titles come from. And so I was wondering, first off, what was the claim that they made when they sent you a letter for cease and desist? What was the actual claim that they made that they put forth to you? And then could you go in a little bit deeper as far as like what you what did the king, how does the king operate fraudulently?
Okay. Well, let's answer the king question first, because that's a history lesson. Because there's the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was issued, which is essentially delineated a line down the eastern coast of Turtle Island, and forbid anybody privately from making contracts with any of the nations to the west of that line. But then what the Crown did is they then went in and started negotiating treaties. Now, the individuals that were negotiating these treaties, and I'm talking about like the Robinson-Huron Treaty, the number treaties, all of these treaties, first off, they were engaging in genocide. So part of the negotiation tactic was to like wipe out the buffalo, which would then place all of these nations into crisis, because now their food is wiped out, and so now they're forced to negotiate. They can't defend their nations or any of that kind of stuff. And the treaties were pushed by the Crown to the point where the people negotiating the treaties were actually paid bonuses for the treaties as they're getting signed. So now they had an incentive. And some of them also were members of private corporations that were benefiting from these treaties. So once the treaties were signed, they could then run these businesses to help people, get paid for helping settlers and that sort of thing, which is a conflict of interest. And they also used forked tongue language, because now they're, having translation to other languages. And so if I came to you and said, well, will you cede your land? No, what seed am I talking about? Am I talking about, planting seeds in the ground and, growing things? Or are we talking about giving my land away? Well, the problem that the Crown had is that the negotiations were with the men, but the men only had the authority to negotiate peace. The women in those nations are actually the ones that held the title for the land, and they're the ones that had the authority to cede the land. And so now we're finding, or at least I'm finding, and I'm confronting the king on this, is, their use of coercion and violence in order to get these peace treaties. And then when the treaties are signed, a lot of the treaties stipulates right in the treaty that, that they would be peaceful, but then they put the nations into reserves, which is essentially a concentration camp. Brought their kids to residential schools and, did medical experiments and, all kinds of horrendous things to colonize the kids and teach them the white man way, which is all cultural genocide. And they did all this through, grants from the Pope through doctrine of discovery. So when I challenged the king on all this stuff, I realized that these treaties weren't done through what most people would consider a valid contract, because a valid contract, you have an offer, you have consideration and acceptance. Well, the contract isn't valid if it's done under force or coercion or threat or any of that kind of stuff. So I challenged the king on all this too. But the reason that they needed the treaties is because in order for the crown to issue a land patent, they need to verify that there's no dispute or counterclaims and that the title is free and clear of any of that. And so I'm asking the king to prove that that was actually the case, because if these treaties did in fact were signed under coercion, violence, and genocide and all that kind of stuff, then the conditions that would make a land patent valid don't exist. And if the land patents fail that, then any titles that were issued, because a title is a grant from the king to possess land, but that needs a land patent in order for the title to be issued. Well, if the treaties are void because of how the crown behaved and invalidated the treaties even after they were signed, means the land patents are invalid, which means any titles that were issued are invalid. The whole house of cards comes falling down.
So
now, I'm not
Sorry,
claiming that that's actually true, but I'm actually asking the king, please demonstrate that this actually isn't true, because if it is true, we got a big problem.
Okay, so then what was it that they said in the cease and desist? What was their claim that you
The
agreed
cease and
to, by the way?
desist letter for building the airship was
Yes.
that I was building without permits.
Okay, so you could agree to that, no problem.
Oh yeah, I'm building without permits. But they had to prove that I needed permits. So my conditional acceptance was, prove that I actually need permits in order to provide for my family and build a shelter.
And it was simple. It was just simply, can you prove that I need permits? You didn't say something like, what law or what bylaw or anything like that. You just said, just prove that I need this, and then from there, nothing else happened. No more letters. No more people came to visit.
Back then it was a bit more convoluted, but where I stand now, one of the first things that I do is I waive my right to be represented as a person. Because as a spiritual being, I have the power and authority to enslave myself. So I want to make it clear that I waive that right. I'm not going to be a person. I stand in spiritual jurisdiction. So I make it clear who I am when I'm communicating with them. Otherwise, because my job is to make sure that I provide clarity. If I'm providing confusion, that's on me. If I confuse the situation, I'm creating a dispute and creating a mess. So I need to be very clear who I am and specifically who I'm not. And then I ask them to prove their claims in order for them to get an acceptance from me to accept their authority and jurisdiction over me, which they can't prove because I'm asking them to prove things that they can't prove. Because they don't actually have a leg to stand on. There's a reason why the state is de facto. De facto means illegitimate, but in effect. And it's in effect because people are participating in it without knowledge. Their own ignorance is what causes the state to have legitimacy.
And so your path with this, operating in, from peace and love, has led to, you being able to sort of circumvent conflict and such. But do you think they are threatened by this kind of shift in people's internal evaluation of their authorities that they're going to adhere to and such? And like at least in Australia, there's a real effort at the moment to sort of ridicule, mock, diminish, tar and feather anyone that wants to entertain discussions like this and ideas. They're kind of all being cast as lunatics, and
Yeah,
hit pieces all the time. Yeah,
the same thing's happening here. But I find, like, there's a famous court ruling here, Meads versus Meads. I don't know if anybody's read it. It was back in 2012, where a judge just railed on, the freemen on the land and all of these different people doing these different commercial remedies and all that kind of stuff. And it was an attempt to tar and feather people who were exploring and trying to deconstruct the system to try to see how it works, so we can figure out how to be free. And interestingly enough, my name wasn't on that document. But are they threatened by me and my work? I don't think so, because I'm not threatening them. I'm not going to war against them. I'm not trying to fight them. I'm not trying to destroy them or, bring down the government or any of that kind of stuff. And a lot of the freedom movement is trying to do that. To me, that's an act of war. And so I'm not down for that. And, in fact, and I've said this many times, like, we need the state, because there's so many people who don't know how to govern themselves, that if the state crashed and burned, things would be far worse, because people will, desperate people will do anything. I'm not afraid of the government. I'm afraid of people who are lost and desperate. That's what I'm afraid of.
In a failed state.
Especially in a failed state.
Yeah.
So, my work is to explore how to navigate life in this way and build a bridge so I can help people make the transition peacefully without threatening the king's jurisdiction or any of that kind of stuff. In fact, and I've said this in my letter to the Queen, I love the Queen. I love the King. They're my brother. They're my sister. And I'm not here to fight them. And if they someday want to redeem themselves, I would invite them to my dinner table and break bread with them. I'm not here to fight people or any of that kind of stuff. I'm interested in let's find a way to heal so we can redeem ourselves and walk through this peacefully.
Yeah, very very dignified, because you don't want to be classified. If you classify it, if you act in certain ways, you can be classified as a belligerent or a lunatic, and your standing at law totally diminishes once you've got those classifications. So you need to be acting in honor, keeping the peace. Because it's the same in Australia. There's the tarring and feather, but there's a whole lot of people that just want to take the number plates off their car and drive at 100, 150 kilometers an hour.
Right.
Drive drunk or whatever, and just say, like, doesn't apply to me. And they haven't done the work ironing out their own issues to operate safely in society without causing harm or risk of the people.
That's not governing themselves when they're doing that. And I use the analogy of a governor on an engine. The governor on the engine is there to ensure that the engine doesn't over rev itself and blow itself apart. It's there to self-restrict. And so self-governance doesn't mean I can do whatever the bleep I want. Self-governance means that I have to govern myself and really be consciously aware of what I'm doing and ensuring that I'm not doing harm to other people. And traveling down, down the highway 150 miles an hour, that's irresponsible, because that's introducing profound risk. And so part of my journey was, I have to be really good at mitigating risk. So when I started traveling, I stopped using the highways. I used to travel on the back roads and that kind of stuff, because I'm 100% responsible and accountable if anything happens. I have nobody else to blame. I have nobody to bail me out. I'm responsible.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do whatever I can to mitigate risks so that I don't hurt anybody. That's self-governance.
I would say, even, it's one thing to go 150 in like a 60 zone, but other people could even say just the fact that you're on the road, let's say operating a vehicle, and forgive me if I'm not using the correct words here, but driving a car without insurance, because that's added risk. Even though you're going within, let's say, a speed limit that's legally defined, you're operating a vehicle. What happens if you hit a kid that crosses the road, right? That is still introducing significant risk. And so, by you saying, let's say, going through different roads that are very far less traveled, that's one way to mitigate risk. But how would you respond to somebody that would say something like that? Like, oh, well, how can you like drive on a road and not have insurance in that case?
Well, my response would be that, my insurance is my tribe, and that's the way it should be. So, but the other thing too is, if anything happens, like for example, if somebody hits me, I'm not going to sue them. I'm not going to file lawsuits or liens or any of that kind of stuff, because now I'm going to war. My job is to forgive them. So if anybody does harm to me, I'm going to forgive them. But if anything, if I harm somebody, then I will ask for forgiveness, and I will do what I can to remedy the situation. And if that means I have to...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I feel like when you say, you ask for forgiveness or you forgive them, I feel like there might be a different definition or interpretation of the word forgive in this case. Let me explain. So, if somebody says, I forgive you, it's kind of like, it's okay type of thing. Or is it literally like, I will give for you and, remedy the situation? Is there a difference in intent or definition of the word that you're using when you say forgive, or is it the same thing? Like, it's just, oh, sorry, it's all good type of thing?
Let's put it this way. If somebody injured me in a car accident, I don't have any expectation that they pay me or try to remedy it, or spend the rest of their life looking after me because I'm quadriplegic or anything like that. The forgiveness that I speak of is to let go of the trauma, let go of the expectations that I would have of them. Because let's face it, I'll probably be feeling angry, feeling violated, or having all of these feelings, and it's these feelings that I need to find within myself to let go of, and that's the forgiveness, so that I'm not carrying around anger, I'm not carrying around venom, I'm not carrying around any of those dark feelings, and also letting go of any expectations that I would have that somebody remedy it. I accept the consequences of anything that happens to me, and trust that spirit will guide me and protect me on my journey. And when it's my time to go, I accept that as well too.
In the different Bibles and different versions, there's been a little like a slide of the words. What originally maybe was debt changed, trespass and sin. Like, what's the relationship there with debt and sin and trespass and forgiveness? To me, it seems the Bible, there's so many levels that it speaks on, but a lot of it is around like kind of debt slavery and systems of oppression through burdens of warfare and taxation and things like that. I guess, yeah, what do you have any comments to share? Because I've seen another Canadian go, he runs the channel Christian Remedy at Law, and he says that debt is sin, and they're sort of almost go hand in hand. And when you are the person, and when you have a person and you have debt bound to you, that you are sort of operating in a world of sin rather than being in God's grace and forgiven.
Yeah, I kind of believe the same. So I've not had debt for years now, and in fact, even my phone, it's prepaid, so I'm not going into debt with anybody. But I also acknowledge that the debt that the person has, it's not technically my debt because the person belongs to the state. It doesn't belong to me. I was just being the legal representative of that corporation. And so there's a lot of manipulation in the system in regards to debt, and people are, they take it personally because it's, they think it's their name and, it's their debt. And when reality is that, the state and the bankers have created this fiat currency and, created currency out of promissory notes and that sort of thing. And that can be remedied fairly simply, but there are supposed to be jubilees to forgive debt, because and there's not supposed to be usury either, because with usury you end up with a situation now where the world is indebted and it's impossible to get out, because if you pay off all the debt, there'd be no money, because money is literally debt. So there are passages in scripture that stipulate that we're supposed to have jubilees on a regular basis to bring everything back into balance and restart over again. And things like that don't happen. So for myself personally, I work really hard not to incur any debt, because I do feel like I'm then subject to the whims of the individual I'm indebted to, and that's a violation of my sovereignty, and I don't want to have those kind of obligations. And so I don't have bank accounts or credit cards or any of that kind of stuff. And like I said, I have a prepaid phone, and that's the only thing that I purchase from the system, is to be able to communicate with people. Otherwise, I work really hard not to incur any debt, and I haven't for years now. But it took a lot of work to clean up my mess, because prior to me doing this, yeah, it was a huge mess. I had mortgages and lines of credit and credit cards and all kinds of stuff. It was a nightmare trying to get all that cleaned up so that I can get to a point where I have no debt. But it also meant that I had to walk away from a lot of stuff too. But that allowed me to change how I define success in my life, because success in my life isn't about, the big house and the bank accounts and, all that kind of stuff, because I can't take any of that with me when my body passes and I return back to the spiritual realm. But what I can take with me is my memories, my experiences, my knowledge, and I glean all that through my relationships. And so now success to me is building healthy, strong relationships. That's how I define success, not through
Material.
material wealth or any of that kind of stuff.
So you're just using Canadian dollars, the bank cash notes, like, to exist, or how do you generally exchange
Yeah,
value with other parties?
Canadian notes, silver, gold, physical commodities. Like I'll accept food, animals, whatever,
Fuel. Yeah.
bartering. But I'm also working on building relationships where, I want to get to a point where I have relationships where we give and receive, not give and take, but be open to me giving of my gifts and me accepting and being open to receiving the gifts of others without scorekeeping, without expectations of outcomes or any of that kind of stuff, but trusting that through giving and receiving, Spirit will orchestrate it so that my needs are being met.
And this,
So, I'm sorry, go ahead, Todd.
well, I guess you're still here, so your needs are being met. But do you waver in that faith or the conviction? Is like,
There are times where it's really, really hard. It's challenging. But I'm all in on the path that I walk. I've never gone a day without food in my belly. I've never gone a day without a roof over my head. When I travel, I've always found ways of getting where I need to go. My needs have been met, but my needs are very, very different than what they were when I was living that materialistic world. It's very, very different.
Yeah, maybe the needs just weren't accurately needs back then. We think we have
Back
needs,
then,
but
there were a
some of
lot
them-
of them were wants, not needs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Excuse me just a minute.
Yeah. So part of my journey was to heal so that I can actually differentiate the difference between a want and a need. And that was a tough one. My false ego wanted a lot of things. But when it comes down to it, what do I really need? It's very simple.
So, you spoke. It's an interesting conversation where we're going, and there's a lot of different directions that I can take this. But one thing I wanted to talk about was money and the fiat currency, and I wanted to explore how you're interacting with that system, and if there is a way for. Obviously, we on the show we talk a lot about Bitcoin and blockchain technology. One of the things that I have shared with you, which was like the day before we got on the show, was an application in order to kind of send and receive Bitcoin. But the thing that I'm curious to know, given that you have a very technical background, is there a way that is it possible? Is there a way that you could see a path where you can continue to live in the spiritual realm under spiritual law, but still interact with, I'll call it internet technology, in order to interact with, like the Bitcoin system? And if not, or maybe there isn't, but from your perspective, what are some of the potential red flags, or what are some of the I guess that's the best way to say it. What are some of the red flags that you are looking at when you look at Bitcoin that you have questions on, or that you want to dive deeper into, understand, like how, whether or not it would violate the way of your living right now? I don't know if that's the best way to ask the question, but I'll let you comment from there.
Yeah, so this has been a struggle I've been confronted with for years. So because I don't have any government issued ID or any of that kind of stuff, so I can't get bank accounts and credit cards or any of that kind of stuff. There are people that have gotten bank accounts without ID and that sort of thing, but for me, I'm not interested in that sort of thing. So I have played around with Bitcoin in the past. I have a Bitcoin wallet that I can trade with people without the need for ID. Right now, like I said, I got a prepaid phone that didn't require ID or any of that kind of stuff, and I'm not going into debt doing it. So, but I do feel that there's going to be a point where a digital ID may be required in order to even access the internet or to have a phone or any of that sort of thing. And at that point, I'm prepared to just unplug everything and not be online, not communicate with people. And that's why I'm working hard to build my tribe so that I'm ready for the time where, I'm going to have to unplug all of this, because I also believe that, as Revelations say, there's going to be a time where one cannot buy or sell without the mark of the beast. And I do see that being a point where, they not only can control services that are online, but even control access to being online. And now, like I said before, prior to us hitting record here, I'm also aware of open source projects that, develop software, for example, like, this computer I'm on right now is running Linux, and, all the software I run on this laptop is open source. But I also know that there are projects that are working on building the physical infrastructure to parallel how most people access the internet. So instead of having to go through TELUS, Bell, or AT&T, or any of these big multinational corporations, we can start building a grassroots infrastructure to be able to communicate. We may not be able to do video, but we could at least connect to the
Audio.
Bitcoin network and transact a Bitcoin transaction, for example. But I'm also working on, building a tribe here and a life where I don't need any of that. My life isn't going to be dependent on it. Everything that we need, we can acquire locally or by, building relationships with other communities, other tribes, where we can then move goods or services to be able to ensure that our needs are being met. It's a very different life. It's a simpler life. But if the projects are there where the technology can start getting rolled out, I would roll it out. My background is, my expertise is computer networking. I've installed computer networks and routers and bridges and all that kind of stuff. I know how all that works. And so, if I'm doing that for my local communities, in order to be able to communicate with people like yourselves, I could do that.
So what sort of infrastructure do you think would be required there? What do you imagine is that sort of physical infrastructure to support it?
Well, for me, because I've been living off grid for so long, I don't trust the power grid. So we would have to have our own methods of generating power to run these devices. So whether we're, installing, water generating stations or solar or, whatever, we would need power sources to be able to run the hardware. I don't think these projects are going to have the means of putting satellites into space or, building towers or that sort of thing. So I don't know. I think some of them are looking at peer-to-peer connections and that sort of thing, but the logistics ends up being quite intense because, you can have little pockets of peer-to-peer connections, but, how do you start connecting all these pockets to others and that sort of thing? And So I haven't been keeping up with what the projects are doing or where they're at, and so I'm anticipating that they're resolving some of the distance logistics, especially in Canada, because we have such distances to deal with. It's different than if you're in the city, but the cities would be easier to do, but they're also more dangerous. And if the power goes out or any of that kind of stuff, the cities will die. Because the cities, you can't sustain the cities. They're just an energy black hole. And so if there's any disruption in the power grid or the food logistics system or any of that kind of stuff, millions of people are going to be in jeopardy and die. And I know there's military protocols where if shit like that happens, they lock the city down, and the protocol is to just go in with body bags and clean it up after, which is horrendous. So, I don't know what the answer is. All I know is that what I can do is build the infrastructure I need here and the relationships that I need, so that when hell breaks loose, we can provide for ourselves. And I don't need to store 10 years worth of food, because we're building relationships and knowledge and experiences to be able to grow our own food and preserve and and maybe even move and build our own shelters and all that kind of stuff, whatever we need to do.
And I guess, what's there is very much a concerted effort in several countries in coordination to implement a digital ID. In Australia's on December the 10th or something, they're going to say kids under 16 can't use certain social sites, which means how do you prove you're not 16, which means you need to have an identity. Britain's doing the same thing with the Brit ID. So it's, I think for 2,000 years, people have probably been saying that the Book of Revelation is upon us, but there are some suggestions that we are getting more towards the end game of the current sort of operating system or social systems that we've got. And I guess confidence in governments is probably at an all-time low. Trust in one another is, we're more disconnected than other. It seems things are getting pretty wonky in the world.
Yeah, and I think AI is going to play a huge role in that as well too. So, the technology is, as far as I'm concerned, is exponentially growing, and I think it's going to be sooner rather than later, where the digital IDs and tie into central bank digital currencies and and even a destruction of the nation state in order to build the 10 kingdoms. I see some of this unfolding, and I'm not suggesting that we're in the 7 days or 7 years of tribulation now, but it could start anytime. And so it's going to take time to learn how to live without the king, and learn how to rebuild our relationship with Mother Earth, and to build the knowledge and the skills and acquire the tools and all that sort of thing to be able to navigate this. And in the end, my belief is that it still comes down to my relationships, because I need people that know how to navigate healthy relationships, how to resolve conflicts or disputes in a healthy, peaceful way, how to, have relationships where we're not keeping score, or relationships are no longer transactional, but we're actually, invested in, this healthy masculine and feminine dynamic within our tribes, to be able to navigate all this. And it takes a lot of time and work. And I can't do this with 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000 people. I can only do this with a handful of people. So I'm looking at finding 10, 20, 30, maybe 50 people to build tribe with, because anything bigger than that, it's too many relationships, because relationships take a lot of time, a lot of energy,
Mm.
a lot of communication, and
Risk.
risk and intimacy and vulnerability, and these kind of things. These are skills and abilities that we're going to need in order to navigate this.
So if you're talking about it, say, a tribulation timeline, potentially being, on the horizon, that would suggest then there's the idea of a second coming. And we've been critical of kings and such, but Christ being referred to as the King of Kings. What do you imagine maybe a second coming and might look like, or what is, is there a king that is legit, a kingdom that is legitimate, like the kingdom of heaven? What does that sort of look like to you?
Well, Christ said the kingdom is within us.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're ready, we'll perform miracles even greater than he. And so, is the second coming him returning? I don't know. But what I do know is that I'm working on embracing that Christ level consciousness within myself and embracing the kingdom that's within me. And in some ways, and I've written about this in my book, that he's been here once already to save us. It's our responsibility now to save ourselves by embracing what he was trying to teach us and walking that path. So could the second coming actually be people embracing Christ level consciousness and doing the work? It's possible. That's what I'm working on. And if he comes down afterwards, great. But I'm also going to be quite discerning, because I also know that there's going to be a lot of lies and deception and that sort of thing too. I have to be extremely careful.
Yeah, many will say they are.
Yep.
Yeah, but yeah, just saying, I guess that's a pragmatic approach. You're not dependent on it. You're not relying on anything. You're doing what was required of yourself here and now to take responsibility for manifesting, generating, or experiencing something heavenly. And maybe heaven isn't the land of convenience, but it's a land of integrity and a land of relationships that are, authentic, potent, and the way that relationships and your community and people can support you in times can be miraculous as well. And the way that you all come together to make sure there's enough for everyone, even then when you wouldn't have thought it, is miraculous in its own right. And if you're cognizant of that, it's good fuel, it's good sustenance, keeps you going, and is fulfilling and nourishing, at least in my experience anyway, seeing those kind of things and being attentive to them.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, I guess you mentioned that you had a Bitcoin wallet. I'm curious to know what wallet exactly is it that you're using, and yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, I haven't used it in years, so I'd have to look it up to see what it is.
Okay.
But I had at one point about 1.11 Bitcoin that I used to give to a friend of mine to develop my website. So
Nice.
that was my way of trading with him.
Nice.
So I'm and I was also involved in the Steam blockchain. I was writing there, and that's how I gained a lot of my crypto. I then converted to Bitcoin. So I did quite a bit with that blockchain as well too.
Is it still? It's still around, right?
Oh yeah,
Steam.
it's still going. Yeah, I didn't like it because there's a lot of political manipulation on the blockchain when, people getting their wallets frozen and all that kind of stuff, which is totally unethical in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I got disillusioned by it, and I was also exploring, well, if this shit hits the fan, if the power goes out, or there's internet disruptions or any of that kind of stuff, I don't have access to any of that. So for me, it was a risk mitigation to find alternative ways of providing for my needs that wasn't dependent on power grid, internet grid, telecommunications grids, or any vendors like Microsoft or Cisco, or any of those kind of things, right? So I did what I could to remove my dependencies on all of them as much as possible.
So we had Dr. Craig Wright on the show last week, who is a contentious figure. There's a small group of people that would state the claim that he's the creator of Bitcoin. There's a larger group of people that would make the claim that he's full of it. But he spoke of developing alternative ways for even broadcasting or any casting or something like that. New protocols there, because multicast is sort of hasn't been picked up on the backbone, but that these protocols would work and complement Bitcoin at a deep level and essentially bind IPv6 and Bitcoin and enable, I guess, granular economic pricing on these things like bandwidth or energy or things like that. So those solutions that you spoke of say like a mesh network, I've seen some of them say, pay $100,000, get this machine here with an antenna on the top, and you can put it there, and then you'll be able to get paid in a stable coin, which to me, right, the stable coin is USDC, and how are you going to, what's the fees? How granularly can you price the the bandwidth or whatever's going through there? So I guess, what's your take on economics and on markets being effective ways to distribute resources that are scarce? And do you think that do you think the free market is a valid mechanism for the allocation of resources, or should it all be just local, very much dependent on relationships? How do you sort of see that side of things?
Well, this is the whole question about the tragedy of the commons, right? So because resources are a common, and it's up to us to be able to navigate that. And currently what I see is that the state and the multinational corporations are the ones that are governing resources now, and not in a healthy, effective way either. They're doing it for their own profits and control rather than benefiting the people. But if we were to replace that, what would that look like? I also have to acknowledge that resources aren't evenly distributed across Mother Earth. There's certain resources that are only located in certain spots and that sort of thing. So how do we address that? These are complicated questions, and I don't think I'm qualified to even respond to that in an appropriate way, because I don't have answers to how that would happen. I do acknowledge that, for example, where I'm here, we have a growing season that's, it must be like 200 days or something. It's just astounding. Where when I was in Alberta or Ontario, our growing season was 88 days. So here would be fantastic for growing fruit and, sweet potatoes and all that kind of stuff, but you can't grow crops here to feed your animals like, wheat or barley or hay, but you sure can do that in Alberta. So, for me, what I've been exploring is, well, let's build relationships with communities in Alberta. And so maybe I, grow fruit here and trade them for hay and grains so that I can have my chickens and, a few goats, and they can have access to fruit. And so I'm making, private trade with people, which is essentially the purest sense of capitalism.
That's a free contract.
Yeah. And, I've been, researching Milton Friedman, who speaks at length about that kind of stuff, and resonating with his work. But it all depends on the relationships. It all depends on people's values and belief structures and their willingness to have these conversations and figure out what's the best way of navigating this so that we don't end up with a situation again where, the crown or the state takes over and multinational corporations take over, and we're just repeating the cycle. And one of the things that I want to do is I want to break the cycle. I don't want to go through a revolution and end up installing another system exactly what we have now. And that's the revolutionary cycle we've been experiencing as humans for thousands of years. How do we break that cycle? Those are the questions I want to ask, and I don't have the answers to that, because in my mind the solution is going to be something that we co-create together. It's not something that I dictate or a intellectual dictates. This is something that we have to navigate and negotiate.
Well, Buckminster Fuller, he says, don't, I think it's him, don't try and fight the system, build a better one that renders the old one obsolete.
Absolutely.
So it's I think on an integrity layer and a personal fulfillment, the building the tribe, the relationships, the actually figuring out what your needs really are, and that's all very good steps. But in terms of making one that renders the old obsolete, it has to have the fitness, I guess, is no external dependencies. So you've de-risked a lot by being more self-sufficient and all that sort of thing. But the competitive advantage is maybe more in the survival and the ability to maintain during those times. But it doesn't, until the failure of the current model, it doesn't seem like it's a system that can outcompete in terms of efficiency and delivering, I guess, trading with someone in Alberta and having, if you're doing that via bartering or something, there's quite a few steps there, and it constrains what is available for the individual to, maybe there's no one who really wants their grain, so they're forced to sort of sell it way lower to someone else who says, look, I'll take some and then I'll get you your lumber or something like that. So having a means of exchange of a value in those systems that's more like a universal commodity or something does seem like it would be a big advantage.
For sure. And I would support that while the infrastructure is in place, with the caveat that the alternatives are in place should anything happen to mitigate risk. Because in the end, in my experience, the vast majority of people resist contemplating what I do because it's not convenient. And it's hard work, and it also requires healing and doing shadow work and really challenging and confronting ourselves on our participation with the system and what that really means, and the violence and the coercion, and there's a lot of shame and a lot of judgment and all that sort of thing as well too. And so it takes a tremendous amount of work to be able to make the transition. And right now, people are still, I call it, they're in their familiarity zone. It's not comfortable, but it's familiar, and they will stay there until the discomfort exceeds the benefits of the familiarity, and then they will step outside of the familiarity zone and start exploring something different. And I think you're bang on. It may not happen until the shit hits the fan and things start to fail. That's when people will start to explore what other options. And
they'll come to your tribe and say, "Can we have some bowl there?"
well, and I'm under no illusion that there's going to be problems, and I also know that I can't help everyone, and nor am I trying to. But I do want to try to build bridges to help people make the transition so that they can help themselves. Like, I want to, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but you teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. So I want to teach people. I want to help people figure this out for themselves so that they're not dependent on me, because I don't want codependency. I'm working on independence and building interdependent relationships with other people who are independent. I'm not interested in building further codependent relationships, because that's not healthy either.
Yeah, you want to achieve, you've got all this wisdom and intelligence to share, and you want to be able to, scale it with leverage rather than be one-to-one, meeting every person who reaches out.
And the thought that I have, because I've been training in martial arts too, like I'm a 3rd degree black belt in Taekwondo. So I want to take a similar approach to the Pesum arts, the art of peace. That Pesum is Latin for peace. So I want to train people in the Pesum arts similar to how we trained in the martial arts, where we gather on a regular basis and we spend time together, and we do the ceremonies and the Sacred Heart circles, and we build our lodges, and grow the gardens, and so over a span of a couple of years, people have acquired all the skills that are required to be able to go through 2 years, because you have multiple seasons in a year, and each season is different, and skill sets are different, and all that kind of stuff. But at least you've gone through a couple cycles. You can then go and start your own classes and train people, because I can't do it all. I need help. And so I'll train the trainers, and hopefully we can help people that way, because then they can integrate their own belief structures or their own customs and their own traditions, or whatever they need for their tribe.
Well, this is why I was interested in seeing how we could, because as we just briefly spoke of right a few minutes ago, is this transitionary period when people try to take that approach and they try to expand their local economy to trade with people at distances that are not convenient to go ahead and meet them face to face. That's where I think something like Bitcoin technology could help facilitate trade remotely. And especially with your background in IT, especially in the BSV space, I think like you could bring a lot of value from your traditional background in IT to the community. And with people being from the community all over the world, it'd be very hard for them to try to compensate you in any which way other than a virtual type of medium like Bitcoin or something similar. And so so I'm just the way I understand and see Bitcoin is, so I look at Bitcoin as like, first I look at the fiat system, and I see manipulation from central banks being able to inflate the money supply, and therefore if we are dependent and trading in that currency, and goods and services are priced in that system, that monetary system, things like houses and stuff like that, then there is a theft of labor that happens sort of behind the scenes that is not out and open. And as much as, everything that you've talked about today, it's amazing and it's like honorable. But if we're dealing with a monetary system like what we're dealing with right now, it's almost like we're trying to build a new world, a new kingdom, if you will, on a foundation of sand, where that we're in a sand pit that is sinking. So this is the thing that I'm interested in. Is I believe in two things: the world that you're describing, the spiritual jurisdiction, and the process that needs to be, the path that needs to be walked in order for people to live that. I recognize that it's extremely difficult and there's a lot of friction. So a couple things need to happen. There has to be a super strong community and a process of passing on knowledge. And so that's where I am interested in building online communities to pass that knowledge through the means of courses and webinars and eventually live meetups and conferences and whatnot. But then also, how do we exchange value from distances? And that's where I see Bitcoin as this monetary system that could potentially replace and in a way for us to sort of opt out of this fiat destructive currency that is a way of, in a way, it's theft. It's like coercion in a way. There's a lot of negative aspects to it that if you work and trade your labor for it, you're going to be indirectly tied and chained to a sinking ship, right?
Yep.
And so I'm very interested in seeing how we can connect the two worlds of integrating Bitcoin, but allowing people to, as Todd says, self-determine, allowing people to still be sovereigns, returning power to the people.
Yeah, I admit that I'm struggling with a few things. One is building a bridge, because where people are at right now and where I'm at, it's such a huge chasm that the vast majority of people can't do that, because it took me 20 years to get where I'm at right now, and we don't have 20 years. So I need to build a bridge, but I don't know what that bridge looks like. And having a means of exchange is important, because right now, and I've done this for years, because I acknowledge that fiat currency is horrible, and if I hold on to it for any length of time, it is getting stolen through inflation and that sort of thing. So, and I've done this for years, where if I get fiat currency, I convert it into something immediately, so that I have something physical and tangible that can't be stolen remotely. If they want to come and take it physically, then they can. But so I've had that philosophy for years. I don't hold on to cash. I use it to acquire things that I need as soon as possible, which makes it a bit challenging, because it makes it hard to save up to purchase bigger items, or that sort of thing. So yeah, if there's a means to help build the bridge, and there's a way of doing that through a technology like Bitcoin, or a blockchain technology like that is and supports people's sovereignty without it being controlled or manipulated by central banks, or the hidden hand of the globalists, then I would entertain that as part of the bridge. And if that helps mediate the process, I'm all for it. I just, for me in my tribe, I would want to make sure that we're not dependent on it. So this is all about questioning dependency. and making sure there's a balance there and the risks are mitigated.
That's where the like
Absolutely.
paper bills are just so handy. In times of war, coinage gets even melted down to use as the metal, and in it they'll make the paper notes. And I would argue that we're pretty much like all times are times of war, really, and at the high levels of things. But yeah, I think even Bitcoin can work to create something where, say, a gold-backed currency, you can actually issue the paper notes, and the serial numbers, the integrity of them is, supplemented by a blockchain record, by an accountable entity that, the contract for the vaulted gold, the guy who's, running the vault signs off, the guy who deposited it, there's remedy there that you know who to go for if, the gold's not in the vault. So some of these things, in Australia, there's some communities that have a system called Let's. Are you familiar with them at all?
No.
So they're like, let's, you might mint a bunch of Let's, and when someone comes around to your place to get some eggs, they might pay you in Let's, you pay them in Let's, and the idea is it's like an external tender instrument that then, sort of you subjectively create some equivalency between, maybe it's 6 eggs to an hour of an electrician's time or something, or 6 dozen eggs to that. But they're fraught with the issues of, they just look like a bit of paper. Maybe they're laminated. They might have, a serial number on them, and that serial number is tracked by one, database. So having the capacity to use the digital system to supplement the physical instruments, that might be a paper note that has a tamper evidence seal on it, that has the serial number in it that represents a gram of gold. And so you're using the commodity, the gold, you're using an informational commodity, the Bitcoin, to carry the metadata about the gold, where it's located, who's the accountable entities, and now you've got a sort of the best of both worlds in a way, where in the event the power drops out, you didn't get some sun for a few days and your solar couldn't charge the batteries, you've still got a mechanism to exchange value, which doesn't involve necessarily taking a ton of grain down to the local plaza and hoping you don't come back with any.
Well, I know that the powers that be want to tokenize the world and, use blockchains to be able to do that, so that, it's not just the gold and the silver, but also the wheat and the sugar and the trees and, the water. Like, they want to tokenize everything. And I'm not down for that. I think that's a very dangerous precedent, because now all of a sudden they'll have an instrument where they can then claim ownership over the whole entire world. That goes even far beyond the fictional construct of titles.
Yeah, it's a system of taxonomy. They really want to be able to track know where everything is, who
who has it and where
living
what's
upon
being
it,
used
where it
for,
is,
and then they can control
how much
what
tax
it
you
can
owe.
be used for, or that, and that's the mark of the beast, where social credit scores is, if your score isn't high enough, then you don't have access to this kind of stuff.
There is sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say, but if there's an alternative that people can use in the meantime in order to acquire the resources they need to establish their tribes, then I would support that, because the reality is that the state controls everything, and we need to start emancipating not only ourselves, but emancipating the resources to be able to build our communities and provide the infrastructure we need. And that has to be emancipated somehow. And so if there's a way to do that, then, I would support something like that.
Yeah, I think of the verse, I'm going to butcher it, but it's what's bound in heaven is loosed in hell, and what's loosed in heaven is comes in hell, as a sort of like talking about two sides of the same coin, or a polarity, a supersymmetry. So the technology that they may, I would imagine for the mark of the beast, it's going to be underwritten by a distributed ledger technology that can be replicated across the world and can allow that. But there'd be nuances and subtleties that differentiate that from a distributed ledger, which can also support the people, and not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, saying that all of them are going to be systems of slavery, when one very much empowers the individual to have as many IPv6 addresses as they want, and so they're able to selectively disclose that which is relevant to them, exercise their digital identity in a self-sovereign fashion, hide in a 256-bit number space, freely exchange value peer-to-peer without an intermediary, have financial sovereignty. Like, that's 95% of the substrate's the same, on a computer systems level as an account-based digital identity nightmare. But there's just those couple of things point the vector in the totally different direction to, lead to a thriving society.
And, one of the things that I do is, when the B system is making claims, I can challenge them on those claims to try to remove commodities and land and that sort of thing from their claims, so that they don't have it on their ledgers and control it. So, there's ways around that, right? So, but that requires work and knowledge to be able to do that. And, those are some of the things that I've been teaching. Like, I emancipated 78 acres in Ontario a couple of years ago, and was even acknowledged by the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario for it. And that allowed me to live on the land without being harassed and that sort of thing. And so, there are ways of doing it now, and it took me 20 years to figure it out, but there are ways. So I do want to start teaching people, because I'm pushing 60, and I don't know how much longer I'm going to be here. So my responsibility is pass on my knowledge to the other generations. And I've been told by a few elders my work is done. So it's time for me to pass on my knowledge. And so that's the scope of the work that I am doing now. All the heavy lifting, leg work, poking the bear, trying to figure out how to deconstruct everything, that's all done now. So I just need to pass on my knowledge, and the next generation can pick it up and build on that.
I will be your first, not first, but I will be happily be your what's the word there for somebody that would study under
apprentice.
Apprentice, yeah, that's right, yeah, absolutely. And like I said, like I there's the two worlds. I feel like, Todd, you represent the Bitcoin world, and then Rob, you also represent the sovereign world, and these are the two that I want to see connected. And what you said, Todd, is absolutely true. It's like, something that could be good for the people could also be, it's interesting, because Bitcoin could potentially, and I envision it will be used also by the system of the beast or the government entities, but it can also be used by the people in a sovereign way, because everything can be, go ahead.
It's a tool like anything else. So a hammer can pound a nail, or it can bash your head in. So if we acknowledge it as a tool and use it as such, now the expression of that tool comes through the intent of the individual using the tool. And so if our intent is honorable and we're standing in spiritual jurisdiction, then we can do great works with it. But if our intent is to enslave people and do harm, then that's going to be the result. So it still comes down to each individual doing the work so that their intent is pure and honorable.
Yeah. So just before we were recording, I was telling you guys both about a guy in Ontario. He goes by the name of Marcus. I don't know anything other than that, but he mentioned he has 2 programs, and it used to be all available and free on YouTube, but now you'd have to go to his website and it's behind like a paywall, right? But anyways, he had two programs. One was the confusion program that kind of opened your eyes and opened your awareness to the system and, you know, the entanglement that you have with the system that you may not even be aware of. The concept of the person, like legal words and how they may not be defined the same way that you would think a word is defined in regular English. So legalese, in other words. Confusion around money, confusion around God, confusion around law, all these types of things that are so integral in everyone's lives. He reveals and exposes how they are, in fact, part of the system that kind of traps and enslaves you. The other set of his programs is called the Unraveled programs, and he, in that, describes the solution in which, you know, you could take, and it leads you towards the King James version of the Bible. And so when I went through that, I eventually got me a King James version of the Bible, and I was not looking at it as a text, as a book of religion. Just like this guy Marcus was saying, he says this isn't actually a text of law. It's a very technical book of law. And so that was the lens that I was reading the book. And through that lens, it was, so the point I'm trying to make is that the solution that he ultimately leads you to is this concept of a pardon, and that God offers a pardon, because in the Bible, I think it's you know, God recognizes that the people have turned their face away from God and they've made themselves another face and with another name, and you know, now they how does it go? Like now they are like gods, and you know, they sit in the throne of God. And so they've sort of ensnared, I think is the phrase that has been used, like they've ensnared themselves to the system. But in order to return, you would have to, you know, ask for that pardon. However, once you accept that pardon, there is only one pardon, and you can't return to your old ways. And if you do, that's like the last straw. There is no other pardon after that. So it's really the whole point of what I'm trying to say is that it's really important that you do the work, the deep work, and change your thinking. Never take action on anything that we're saying here. Or be a rebel and try to test the system like I did when I was 19 and try to speed, because like everything that we talked about, right? Because I was learning about the system and how I'm not the person. So like nobody can give me a ticket. I played around with all that stuff and did the things the wrong way. But there's a maturation process that you would need to go through, and I would suggest that people don't do anything until it really makes sense to them, right? They can see it in black and white. Like if it makes sense to you that like there is no way that any other legal fiction can claim something over you unless you give them permission. If that doesn't make absolute sense to you, then don't try to play around with this until you do the work and you fully comprehend it. And so, you know, that is something that yeah, I want to help facilitate. So you said you're wanting to, you know, start to teach and stuff, and I think that can go hand in hand with you teaching, building community, and connecting these teachings and community all through online communities, online mediums of exchanges via Bitcoin, and sharing knowledge in the community so that people can take the steps required to be responsible and to be independent and create healthy relationships that are interdependent. And so it's a huge undertaking, but I would, you know, invite you to engage with the people of the BSV community. I think once people actually watch this episode, especially with your background in IT and systems and whatnot, I think that your expertise is going to be very much needed, especially right now in this moment with the release of their Terra node. They're looking for people that have these types of expertise that could revise the code, that could look at it from a security perspective, to see how they can harden the code and whatnot. And so this is not something that is, you're going to watch a YouTube video and an interview at one time and start to try to activate this stuff that we're talking about. It's something that I think we need to sort of build this recurring meeting and recurring sort of conversations through, I think, communities, where there could be sort of like a structured pathway to passing the knowledge on from what you've discovered over the last 20 years and the results you've been able to achieve to people that are interested in taking that path. So I think this would probably be a really good time for you to talk about your book that you had on your website, and maybe people, if they're interested, could you can tell them where to go to take a look and how they can, follow you on socials and get in contact with you if they're interested.
Yeah, I agree. This is not a easy choice. The implications are profound and the changes are profound, and you're right. Once you take that step, there's no going back. If I try to go back into the system, I'm sure the king would jump all over my butt big time. And I also, share in scripture, 1 Samuel 8. That's a conversation between King Samuel and God, and King Samuel is saying, well, all these people, they want me to govern over them. And God told him, well, do it. It's not you they're rejecting, it's me. But tell them, if they want an earthly king, these are going to be the consequences. And if you read it, that's exactly what's going on right now. So that passage isn't about why we have government. That passage is about the consequences of us abandoning God. And, and he said, I'm not going to be there to save you if you have a king, but I will protect you if you trust God and abandon the king. So that's what I speak about in my book. I talk about, the spiritual realm, the physical realm, the fictional realm, and feudalism, but I also go into length about my own journey for healing and trying to reconcile my relationship with myself and how to walk that path. So you can find it on my website, pacemarts.com. That's PACEMARTS.com. I also have it pinned on my Facebook wall. You can find me on Facebook, Rob in the Paget family. And I post there every day. And right now I'm exploring tribe building and relationship between the divine masculine and divine feminine and what that looks like. And, it's challenging work because, we've been raised with lies and deception and lots of perceptions and assumptions and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, it's not easy reading what I write. It triggers people. It really confronts and challenges people on what they're currently doing. But if people are willing to do the work, I'm willing to hold space for that. And I also hold Sacred Heart Circles every Saturday evening on Zoom, which is free as well. These are gifts that I give for free. I don't charge people. If people want to donate to support my work, I'll accept that. But I'm giving this away for free. No expectations, no attachments. People want to come to my Sacred Heart Circles. It's 5 to 7 Pacific, which is 6 to 8 Mountain, or 8 to 10 Eastern, where we have a safe space to be vulnerable and really do the work and really challenge our thoughts and, connect with our feelings and do the shadow work and all that kind of stuff, because that's the core work that's needed in order to hold the charge of what it means to actually walk a sovereign life and have spirit, have the creator govern ourselves. And I know from trying for 20 years, trying to build tribe, it's always failed because of unresolved shadows and traumas and colonial ideas. They always sabotaged those efforts. So the Sacred Heart Circle is core, and so I offer that for free as well too. So and people can download my book for free off my Facebook page as well too.
Awesome. Todd, any last thoughts or closing comments?
Yeah, just gratitude. Thank you for coming on. You didn't really know what you were getting yourself into, but it's been a fascinating chat. I'd love to sit down and have a couple of days hanging out to talk more, and maybe there's certain things off the record as well. But yeah, it's very, very interesting, admirable. Power to you for what you've done, and very much appreciate your abundant philosophy of giving away what you've learned, holding space for people, and I hope that, I would say maybe encourage you just to have a look at some of the other episodes if you've enjoyed this, some of the earlier ones we've done, because I think we are different than the rest of crypto. There's still plenty of riffraff and noise in BSV as well, and greed and shadow, but there is generally a higher representation of sophisticated thinking around certain topics, an appetite for sovereignty, a recognition of what can happen when power sort of takes something and makes a de facto implementation rather than a legitimate implementation of certain things. So I hope that you've had a good time, and you see that there's some people with their heads still screwed on somewhat straight rather than the rest of the crypto clown show. Thanks again. Tons of gratitude, and reach out if you ever want to learn anything more. Would love to help you figure out what the bridge looks like.
Thank you. I did enjoy myself. It was a wonderful conversation, and thank you, Anil, for the invitation. It's been years and years since we met in Edmonton, but I appreciate the opportunity to come and share my work and my journey with you and those that are listening. So I appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
It's been an honor following your journeys. It's something that I haven't seen very many people following your footsteps, right? So I would say, you are probably one of the earliest figures that I have come in encounter with that was taking that path of sovereignty. And, there have been other people that I've come across that would typically go the route of using the system's tools against the system itself. And I've eventually always found that you just get entangled with the system more, and you think that you're gonna outsmart a crooked system with their own tools, and when it doesn't go your way, you're surprised, and you're again, you're taking an approach of war, as you would say, right? What's the word? Adversarial approach, whereas you and literally only you and the other guy that I found in Ontario are taking this approach of, well, let's just take another path, and let's take the approach of love and peace, and I think that's why it's been that's why I've been following you for so many years. And so again, an honor to have you on the show. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and if you can stay on after we end the recording, just so we can kind of have a wrap up afterwards, that'd be great. I really enjoyed it, and again, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge with the community, the BSV community, and the broader audience that watches this video eventually. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, cheers. I like how many times you said proof and claim. It really showed that you were the right fit for the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I'll see you guys in the next one then.